A cold wind moves across an endless desert, brushing over sand that has been walked smooth by centuries of footsteps. In the distance, bells chime softly, camels shifting under starlight, fires flickering low as silhouettes gather at the edge of the known world. This is not the beginning of a war, nor the rise of an empire, but the birth of a connection that would quietly change history forever. Between East and West, before borders hardened and names were written in stone, there lived traders who carried more than silk and silver. They carried languages, beliefs, letters from home, and the fragile trust that bound civilizations together. Their story is one of discovery and survival, of pride without conquest, of influence earned through patience rather than force. As you picture this ancient road stretching into darkness, ask yourself, if you stood here tonight, what would you notice first? The silence of the desert, the weight of the journey ahead, or the promise of worlds you've never seen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and share where you're listening from and whether it's day or night where you are. If this journey calls to you, gently tap like and subscribe and settle in for a story meant to carry you far. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and step onto the road where the desert first learned to speak in silk. Before the road had a name, before it was traced in ink or measured in days, there was only the land itself, wide, patient, and listening. The deserts of Central Asia did not appear empty to those who knew them well. At dawn, their sands cooled like smooth stone beneath bare feet. At dusk, the wind carried faint sounds, the shifting of grain, the soft call of birds settling into scrub, the distant murmur of water hidden beneath earth and time. It was here, in this vast breathing space between mountains and empires, that the first quiet exchanges began. Imagine the desert not as a barrier, but as a meeting place. Oases rose like islands, their date palms bending over clear pools, their soil dark and generous. Around them, people gathered, herders, farmers, travellers, all drawn by water and shade. Goods passed from hand to hand, almost without ceremony. Wool for grain, metal for salt, stories for shelter. No one yet spoke of global trade. No one imagined continents linked by caravans. But the habit of exchange had already taken root, as natural as breathing. Far to the east, silkworms fed on mulberry leaves, spinning threads so fine they seemed almost unreal. Far to the west, glass was blown into fragile vessels, catching light like frozen water. Between these worlds stretched thousands of miles of steppe, desert, and mountain. And in the middle lived people who learned to listen, to languages, to landscapes, to opportunity. Long before they were called Sogdians, they were simply neighbours of the road. The land that would become Sogdiana lay between two great rivers, the Oxus and the Jaxartes, their waters cutting green paths through dry plains. Snowmelt from distant peaks fed these rivers, and along their banks grew wheat, grapes, and apricots. Cities rose slowly, shaped by mudbrick and sun, their walls the colour of the earth itself. These were not grand capitals of empire, but living places, practical, adaptable, and open to the world beyond their gates. From early on, movement defined life here. Seasons mattered, weather mattered. Knowing when to leave, when to wait, when to turn back could mean survival. People learned to read the sky, the grass, the behaviour of animals. They learned that knowledge, like goods, gained value when shared. A safe path through a mountain pass could be worth more than gold. A warning about a dried-up well could save a caravan. As centuries passed, paths became routes. Routes became expectations. Travelers began to move not just out of necessity, but with intention. They carried bundles wrapped in cloth, tied carefully to the sides of pack animals. They carried news of wars far away, of rulers rising and falling, of markets hungry for new things. The desert listened, and slowly it answered. Silk was not the first treasure to cross these lands, but it became the most famous. Light, strong, and unlike anything seen before, it shimmered even in low firelight. To touch it was to feel something almost alive. When silk appeared in Western markets, it stirred curiosity and desire. Where had it come from? Who made it? What lay beyond the horizon where such wonders were born? The people of Central Asia did not need to know every secret to recognize an opportunity. They understood distance. They understood trust. They understood that value often lived in between buyer and seller, between origin and destination. They became skilled at moving goods step by step, trade by trade, never claiming to own the whole road, yet belonging to all of it. In the evenings, caravans gathered outside city walls. Fires flickered low, fed by dried dung and sparse wood. Meals were simple: bread, dried fruit, watered wine, but shared generously. Languages blended in the dark. Iranian tongues, Turkic sounds, bits of speech from farther east and farther west. No one corrected accents. Meaning mattered more than precision. Laughter travelled easily. So did caution. Children grew up watching these scenes. They learned early that the world was larger than their city, larger even than their valley. They learned to count not only coins, but days of travel. They learned to recognize fabrics by touch, metals by weight, people by the way they kept their word. Memory became a map. Reputation became currency. Over time, certain families became known for their skill in moving between worlds. They knew which goods would survive the journey, which rulers demanded gifts, which routes were safest after winter snows. They learned to adapt, to blend in, to observe quietly before acting. These were the people who would one day be called the great traders of the Silk Road, though the road itself was still forming, still unnamed, still alive with possibility. The desert, patient as ever, bore witness. It watched as paths deepened under repeated footsteps. It watched as camels replaced horses on longer routes, their steady gait better suited to endless sand. It watched as cities grew more confident, their markets louder, their walls thicker, their horizons broader. Yet even as trade expanded, life remained intimate. People still paused at wells, still shared shade, still looked up at the same stars their ancestors had known. The movement of goods did not erase the rhythms of daily life. It flowed alongside them, like a river finding its course. This was the beginning, though no one standing there would have called it that. There were no proclamations, no grand openings, no single moment when the road announced itself. Instead, it emerged quietly, shaped by countless small decisions, acts of trust, and journeys begun before sunrise. And as the desert learned to speak in silk, it also learned to listen to the footsteps of those who would carry its voice far beyond the horizon, moving onward, always onward, towards cities not yet seen, carrying with them the first breath of a world newly connected, and the promise of what lay just ahead, waiting to be discovered as the road continued to unfold. The land that shaped the Sogdians was neither hidden nor isolated. It lay open, stretched between forces far larger than itself, and for that very reason it learned how to endure. To the south flowed the Oxus River, wide and deliberate, carrying glacial waters down from distant mountains. To the north ran the Jaxartes, quicker and more unpredictable, cutting through steppe and grassland before disappearing into the dry earth. Between these two rivers spread a region of valleys, orchards, and sun-baked plains, a place later known as Sogdiana. Here, water determined everything. Channels were dug by hand, lined with clay and stone, guiding life into fields of barley and wheat. Vineyards climbed gentle slopes. Apricot and pomegranate trees offered shade and sweetness in the heat. Cities formed not from conquest, but from patience layers of settlement built atop one another, each generation repairing walls, deepening wells, widening markets. These were places meant to last, even as the world beyond them shifted. Sogdiana sat at a crossroads not only of geography but of power. To the west, great empires rose from Persia, bringing systems of administration, taxation, and law. To the east, the Chinese heartland expanded and contracted, its influence carried outward by diplomacy and defense. From the north came nomadic confederations, masters of the open steppe, while to the south lay mountain routes leading into India and beyond. No single force held this land for long, yet all passed through it. This constant proximity to empire taught the people of Sogdiana a particular skill: how to exist without being erased. They learned when to comply and when to wait. They learned that survival did not always require resistance, but adaptation. Rulers changed, borders shifted, banners rose and fell, yet the markets continued to open at dawn, and the canals continued to carry water to the fields. Language reflected this layered world. The Sogdian tongue belonged to the Iranian family, shaped by ancient roots and practical use, but it rarely stood alone. In streets and caravanserais, it mingled with Persian, Bactrian, Turkic dialects, and later Chinese. People switched languages with ease, often within a single conversation. Communication was not a display of purity, but a tool, something meant to work. Religion, too, arrived early and often. Fire temples stood beside shrines of older local spirits. Zoroastrian beliefs shaped ideas of order and morality, emphasizing truth, balance, and responsibility. Yet other faiths passed through as well, carried by travelers and monks. The land did not demand a single answer to the nature of the world. It allowed questions to coexist. Children growing up in Sogdiana learned history not from scrolls, but from observation. They watched officials arrive from distant capitals, dressed in unfamiliar styles. They saw soldiers pass through, sometimes welcomed, sometimes feared. They listened to elders discuss which ruler now claimed authority, and what that might mean for taxes, safety, or opportunity. From an early age, they understood that stability was something to be tended, not assumed. The cities themselves reflected this awareness. Walls were strong, but not ostentatious. Gates were built wide enough for caravans, guarded but rarely sealed. Markets were placed near main roads, open to visitors. Inns and warehouses clustered near entrances, ready to receive goods from afar. Even architecture seemed to lean outward, as if listening for footsteps. Samarkand, Bukhara, and other centres grew into hubs of exchange long before their names echoed across continents. Their streets were narrow to provide shade, their courtyards designed to catch breezes. Water flowed visibly through channels, reminding everyone of its value. In the evenings, the smell of baking bread, mixed with that of animal hides, oil lamps, and dust, carried in from the road. Trade was not yet global, but it was already intricate. Goods moved in stages. A bolt of cloth might pass through several hands before reaching its final buyer. Each exchange added value through transport, protection, knowledge of markets. The people of Sogdiana became experts at these middle spaces, these in-between moments where decisions mattered most. Empires often underestimated such regions. They measured power in land controlled and armies commanded. Sogdiana measured it differently in relationships maintained, roots remembered, and trust preserved across distance. When conflict closed one path, another could be found. When rulers demanded loyalty, it was offered carefully, without surrendering identity. Yet life was not without uncertainty. Floods could wash away canals, droughts could empty wells. Raids from the steppe reminded cities of their vulnerability. In response, communities relied on cooperation. Repairs were shared, harvests were stored. Watchtowers were maintained not by distant authorities, but by locals who understood what was at stake. In quiet moments, people gathered to talk. Elders told stories of earlier times, of migrations and settlements, of bargains struck and journeys survived. These stories did more than entertain, they taught. They passed down practical wisdom, where to travel after spring rains, how to judge a stranger's intent, which goods spoiled quickly and which endured. Slowly, almost without noticing, Sogdiana became something more than a place people passed through. It became a place people relied upon. Caravans planned their journeys around its cities. Messengers trusted its roads. Pilgrims found rest within its walls. Knowledge accumulated here, layered like the bricks beneath the streets. And through it all, the rivers continued their steady work. They carried silt and life, marking time more reliably than any ruler's reign. Each year they reminded the people that permanence came not from power, but from balance between land and water, movement and rest, openness and caution. This was the cradle from which the great traders would emerge, not from sudden ambition, but from generations shaped by geography and experience, from living daily at the edge of many worlds, learning to belong to none fully, and to all in part. As the night deepens and the mind drifts, imagine standing on a city wall at dusk. The rivers glint faintly in the distance. Beyond them lie mountains, deserts, and roads stretching farther than sight. Somewhere below, a gate creaks open. A caravan arrives, tired but hopeful. And the land between rivers and empires welcomes them once more, ready to pass along not just goods, but the quiet knowledge that the road is alive, and the journey has only just begun, continuing onward into the lives of those born to walk it. For the children born in the cities of Sogdiana, the road was never something distant or abstract. It was present from the beginning, woven quietly into everyday life. They heard it before they understood it. The low murmur of voices outside the walls before dawn, the soft bells tied to pack animals, the creak of leather and wood as caravans prepared to depart. Even in sleep, these sounds became familiar, settling into memory like a lullaby carried on the desert air. Homes were built close together, their courtyards opening inward, offering cool shade and safety from the heat. Within these walls, children learned their first lessons, not from formal instruction, but from observation. They watched adults weigh goods carefully in their hands, testing balance and texture. They listened as prices were discussed in calm, measured tones, never rushed, never loud. From an early age, they absorbed the idea that patience was a form of strength. Play often mirrored the world around them. In dusty corners of courtyards, children arranged stones and scraps of cloth as if they were goods in a market stall. They pretended to negotiate, copying the gestures and expressions they had seen so many times before. Older children taught younger ones how to count using pebbles, how to recognize simple symbols scratched into wood or clay. Learning was communal, passed along naturally, without ceremony. Language came easily to them. Words from different tongues drifted through streets and markets, and children picked them up without effort. A greeting here, a phrase there, enough to be understood, enough to respond politely. Accents were unimportant. Meaning was what mattered. This flexibility of speech became a quiet advantage, allowing them to move comfortably between visitors from faraway places. As they grew older, children began to accompany adults beyond the city gates. At first, journeys were short to nearby fields, to neighboring villages, to river crossings. They learned how to pack supplies carefully, how to secure loads so they would not shift. They learned to watch the sky for signs of weather, to note changes in the wind. These lessons were not framed as training, but as shared experience. Meals along the road were simple and memorable. Bread baked flat and warm, dried fruit softened in water, cheese wrapped in cloth. Food was eaten slowly, often in silence, with an awareness of the landscape stretching in all directions. In these moments, children learned that travel was not about speed, but endurance. At night, fires burned low. Stories were told softly, shaped to fit the mood of the dark. Elders spoke of long journeys, of narrow escapes, of friendships formed far from home. They spoke not to impress, but to teach. Each story carried a lesson about caution, generosity, or the importance of keeping one's word. Children listened closely, their imaginations travelling farther than their feet ever could. Trust was introduced early. Children were given small responsibilities, carrying messages, watching over animals, guarding bundles while adults spoke. These tasks were not tests, but invitations into the shared life of the community. Mistakes were corrected gently. The goal was not perfection, but awareness. The road also brought moments of wonder. Exotic goods appeared in markets, unlike anything made locally. Smooth glass that caught the light, spices that filled the air with unfamiliar scents, fabrics dyed in deep colours that seemed to hold the sky or the sea within them. Children touched these items with careful hands, feeling the difference, asking quiet questions. Each object hinted at places beyond the horizon, places they might one day see. Education continued in practical ways. Children learned to read simple accounts, to recognize numbers scratched into tablets or written with ink. They learned which goods spoiled quickly, which survived heat and cold. They learned that some items carried more than material value, that religious objects, letters, and gifts required extra care and respect. As adolescence approached, choices began to appear. Some children felt drawn to the fields and crafts of their home cities. Others felt the pull of the road more strongly. This was not forced. Families understood that each role mattered. A stable home made long journeys possible. Those who stayed ensured that those who travelled had somewhere to return. For those who chose the road, preparation deepened. Journeys grew longer. Routes became more complex. They learned how to read people, as well as landscapes, how to sense hesitation, how to recognize honesty, how to step back when trust was uncertain. These skills were as important as any map. Yet even those who travelled far carried their upbringing with them. The sounds of their childhood cities stayed close, the splash of water in channels, the call of merchants, the evening quiet as gates closed. These memories anchored them, offering comfort during long nights beneath open skies. The caravan road did not belong to one generation. It was inherited, shaped by countless lives moving through it. Each child added something new, a phrase learned, a route remembered, a friendship formed. Over time, these small additions accumulated, strengthening the web of connections that held the world together. And so, in the steady rhythm of footsteps and hooves, a people grew who understood movement as naturally as others understood soil or stone. They did not see travel as departure, but as continuation. The road was not an escape from home, but an extension of it. As the stars emerged above the desert, children lay beside the fire, wrapped in blankets, listening to the distant sounds of the caravan settling for the night. Tomorrow would bring more walking, more learning, more stories added quietly to memory. And in this gentle passing of knowledge, from one generation to the next, the caravan road shaped its children, carrying them forward, just as it had always done, into the unfolding journey ahead. As the children of Sogdiana grew into adulthood, many carried with them a quiet confidence shaped by years of listening. By the time they stepped fully onto the caravan road, they understood something essential. Trade was not only the movement of goods, but the meeting of minds. To travel far was to enter other worlds, and to survive there required more than strength or courage. It required the ability to speak not just in words, but in tone, gesture, and patience. The Sogdian merchants became known for this skill. They did not arrive loudly, announcing themselves as strangers. Instead, they observed first. In a new market, they watched how people stood, how they greeted one another, how bargains were opened and closed. They noticed which words carried respect, which gestures signaled trust. Only then did they step forward, speaking carefully, adjusting their language as naturally as one might adjust a cloak against the wind. Their speech was layered. At home, Sogdian remained the language of family and memory, rich with familiar sounds and shared meanings, but on the road, other tongues unfolded with ease. Persian was useful in administrative centres and older imperial cities. Turkic dialects opened doors on the steppe. In the East, Chinese words were learned slowly and respectfully, often aided by interpreters, gestures, and written signs. No language was considered beneath learning. Each one was a key. This flexibility was not accidental. It was taught, practiced, refined. Young merchants learned phrases the way others learned routes. They memorized greetings, polite refusals, expressions of gratitude. They learned how to listen for meaning beyond words, especially when accents blurred clarity. Silence, too, became a form of speech, a pause that allowed others to fill the space, revealing more than they intended. Written language mattered as well. Letters travelled with caravans, folded carefully and protected from dust and rain. These messages carried news of prices, political changes, family matters, and opportunities ahead. To read and write was to stay connected across distance. Sogdian script flowed across paper and parchment, but merchants often learned other writing systems too, recognizing names, numbers, and seals, even when they could not read every word. Trust formed the foundation of everything. Goods were often valuable, journeys long, outcomes uncertain. Agreements were sealed not only with coins, but with reputation. A merchant who broke a promise might find doors closed far beyond a single city. Word travelled quickly along the road, carried by travellers who remembered kindness as clearly as deceit. Because of this, Sogdian merchants cultivated reliability as carefully as profit. They paid debts promptly. They honoured contracts even when circumstances shifted. When disputes arose, they sought compromise before conflict. This approach did not make them weak, it made them welcome. Over time, rulers, officials, and fellow traders came to rely on them as intermediaries, people who could move between cultures without provoking fear. Markets reflected this blending of worlds. In a single square, one might hear several languages at once, see clothing styles layered together, smell spices from distant regions mingling in the air. Sogdian merchants stood comfortably in the middle of this flow, translating not just words, but expectations. They explained customs, smoothed misunderstandings, and ensured that exchanges ended with mutual satisfaction. Their ability to navigate different belief systems added another layer to their skill. They encountered followers of many faiths: Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Manichaeans, later Christians, and others. Rather than rejecting unfamiliar practices, they observed them with curiosity and respect. They learned which days were sacred, which foods were avoided, which gestures were offensive. This awareness prevented unnecessary tension and often opened deeper relationships. Travel itself sharpened these abilities. Long days on the road created opportunities for conversation. Shared hardships, sudden storms, lost animals, delayed crossings encouraged cooperation. Around evening fires, merchants exchanged stories, gradually revealing their backgrounds and values. In these moments, differences softened. What remained were shared human concerns: safety, family, hope for prosperity. The Sogdian merchant did not see identity as something fragile. It did not dissolve when exposed to other cultures. Instead, it grew stronger through contact. By understanding others, they clarified themselves. They knew who they were, and because of that, they could adapt without losing their core. This adaptability made them indispensable. When empires sought to extend influence across unfamiliar regions, they turned to those who already understood the terrain, both physical and cultural. Sogdian merchants served as guides, advisors, and facilitators. They carried diplomatic gifts, explained local customs, and ensured that messages reached their destinations intact. Yet despite their wide reach, they rarely sought political power for its own sake. Their strength lay in connection, not control. They preferred influence that moved quietly, like water through channels, shaping outcomes without demanding attention. This approach allowed them to endure even as rulers changed. At home, these experiences filtered back into daily life. New words entered the language. New foods appeared on tables. New ideas found space alongside old traditions. The cities of Sogdiana became mirrors of the road itself, layered, diverse, and constantly evolving. In the evenings, merchants returned from journeys and sat with family, recounting what they had seen. They spoke of distant landscapes, unfamiliar customs, and lessons learned through careful listening. Children absorbed these stories, just as earlier generations had, adding them to their growing understanding of the world. And so, generation by generation, a people emerged who understood, that speaking many tongues was not about mastery, but respect. It was about meeting others where they stood and inviting them gently into conversation. As night settles once more over the caravan road, imagine a merchant pausing at the edge of a foreign city. The gate stands open. Voices drift outward, unfamiliar yet welcoming. With a steady breath and a practiced ear, they step forward, ready to speak and to listen, as the road carries them onward into the next meeting, the next exchange, the next quiet thread woven into the fabric of a connected world. The cities of Sogdiana did not rise in sudden splendor. They grew the way living things grow slowly, patiently, shaped by need and experience. Built from clay drawn straight from the earth, their walls blended into the landscape, warm in color and steady in purpose. To travelers approaching from afar, these cities seemed to emerge gently from the dust, as if the land itself had decided to gather and shelter human life. Within their walls, everything moved toward the market. Streets curved and narrowed, guiding people naturally toward open squares, where voices mingled and goods changed hands. These were not places of chaos, but of practiced rhythm. Each stall had its place. Each merchant knew when to speak and when to wait. The air carried layered scents, leather, oil, grain, smoke, spice familiar enough to be comforting, varied enough to stir curiosity. Clay buildings surrounded the markets, their flat roofs catching the sun by day and releasing warmth at night. Wooden beams creaked softly overhead. Awning cloths fluttered in the breeze, offering shade. Water channels ran along the edges of streets, keeping dust down and life flowing. Even in heat, the cities felt alive rather than oppressive, designed for endurance rather than display. Sogdian cities were not isolated hubs, they were crossroads. Caravans arrived from every direction, their animals weary, their loads heavy with promise. Some travellers stayed only a night, others weeks. Warehouses stood near gates, offering safe storage for goods awaiting resale or further transport. Inns provided food, rest and news places where strangers became temporary neighbours. Markets opened early. As light crept over the walls, merchants laid out their wares with care. Silk was unrolled slowly, catching the eye without shouting. Metals were arranged to reflect the sun. Spices remained sealed until interest was shown. Their scents released deliberately. Each action was intentional. Presentation mattered, but honesty mattered more. Buyers came from all walks of life. Local farmers traded surplus grain. Artisans sought materials for their crafts. Envoys and officials purchased gifts for distant courts. Nomads arrived with animal products and information from the steppe. Each transaction carried not just economic value, but social weight. A fair exchange strengthened trust. An unfair one lingered in memory. The Sogdians excelled in this environment because they understood balance. They knew that markets thrived not when one party dominated, but when both left satisfied. Bargaining was expected, even enjoyed, but it followed unspoken rules. Voices remained calm. Gestures stayed respectful. A deal concluded with shared acknowledgement, sometimes a nod, sometimes a handshake, sometimes a quiet smile. Beyond goods, ideas moved freely through these spaces. News of distant events spread quickly. A battle lost or won, a new ruler crowned, a road closed by snow, all of this mattered to those who lived by movement. Information was traded as readily as cloth or coin, often more valuable in the long run. Craftsmanship flourished alongside trade. Local artisans adapted styles and techniques learned from afar. Glassware inspired new forms of pottery. Foreign patterns appeared in textiles. Over time, the cities developed distinct identities, shaped by what passed through them as much as by what originated there. Culture became layered, like the walls built and rebuilt over generations. Religion found expression in the cities as well. Temples and shrines stood not far from markets, reminding visitors that trade and belief often travelled together. Some merchants paused to offer thanks for safe passage. Others sought blessings for journeys yet to come. The coexistence of different practices was not always seamless, but it was largely accepted. Diversity had become a fact of daily life. Even governance reflected this openness. City leaders understood that prosperity depended on access. Gates were maintained, roads were repaired, taxes were levied carefully, aware that too heavy a hand could drive trade elsewhere. Stability mattered more than spectacle. A city known for fairness attracted travellers. One known for greed was quietly avoided. At night, the city softened. Market stalls closed. Fires were lit in courtyards. Families gathered to eat, sharing meals shaped by many influences. Stories from the road were retold, altered slightly each time, gaining richness through repetition. Outside the walls, caravans settled into rest, their animals tethered, their guards alert but calm. For merchants, these cities were more than stopping points. They were anchors, places to recover, to plan, to reconnect. Relationships were renewed here, partnerships formed, marriages arranged, children were born who would one day walk the same streets, hearing the same sounds, feeling the same pull of the road beyond the gates. Over time, the reputation of Sogdian cities spread far beyond their walls. They became known as reliable centres of exchange, places where deals could be made and honoured. Their names appeared in distant records, spoken in courts and camps alike. Yet within the cities themselves, life remained grounded, focused on daily rhythms rather than distant fame. Clay walls were repaired after storms, canals were cleared after floods, markets reopened each morning, no matter what changes the wider world had undergone. This continuity gave the cities strength. While empires rose and fell, these places endured, shaped not by conquest, but by connection. As the road continued to weave through them, the cities adapted without losing themselves. They absorbed influences gently, selecting what fit, discarding what did not. In doing so, they became living archives of the Silk Road places, where the world could be seen, heard, and felt in a single walk through the market. Imagine standing in one of these cities at twilight. The sky fades from gold to deep blue. Lamps flicker to life. The market quiets, but does not sleep. Somewhere nearby, a traveller speaks in a foreign tongue, and someone answers, understanding enough to respond. The clay walls hold the warmth of the day. The road rests for a moment. And within these cities of clay, the markets of the world continue to breathe, ready for dawn, ready for movement, ready to send people and goods onward once more, as the great network of exchange flows gently forward into the next chapter of its long, unbroken journey. Along the caravan roads, not everything that moved could be weighed or counted. Some things travelled more quietly, carried not in bundles or chests, but in memory and belief. As merchants crossed deserts and mountains, they brought with them stories about the nature of the world, about good and evil, about what awaited beyond this life. In Sogdiana, These ideas did not arrive all at once, nor did they demand exclusivity. They arrived the way travelers did, one by one, seeking space to rest. Religion in Sogdian lands was never confined to a single voice. From early times, Zoroastrian belief formed a familiar foundation. Fire, kept clean and tended carefully, symbolized truth and order. Light stood for goodness, and each person was believed to carry responsibility for their choices. These ideas shaped daily life quietly, influencing how people spoke of honesty, balance, and duty without overwhelming other traditions. Yet the road brought alternatives. Buddhist monks traveled with caravans, their robes dusty from long journeys, their presence calm and deliberate. They spoke of suffering and release, of cycles of rebirth, of compassion practiced through understanding. Some settled temporarily near cities, offering teachings to those who were curious. Others moved on, leaving behind only impressions and fragments of thought that lingered long after they were gone. Manichaean missionaries arrived as well, carrying texts and images that described a universe divided between light and darkness. Their message resonated with traders who understood duality, profit and loss, danger and safety, departure and return. Manichaeism spread easily along trade routes, its portable teachings well suited to people always in motion. It required no fixed temple, only listeners willing to reflect. Later, still came Christian communities, often from the East, following paths less traveled by imperial armies, but familiar to merchants. Their churches were modest, their rituals subdued. They spoke of humility, endurance, and a faith that could survive far from its place of origin. In Sogdian cities, these communities lived alongside others, not dominant, but present. What made Sogdiana distinctive was not the number of beliefs present, but the way they coexisted. Faith was rarely enforced through authority. Instead, it was explored through conversation. Around fires at night, travelers compared ideas gently. They asked questions. They listened. Agreement was not required for respect. This openness did not mean indifference. People cared deeply about meaning. They observed rituals carefully, noting how others prayed, fasted, or marked sacred days. They learned which gestures showed reverence, which words were avoided. This awareness was practical as much as philosophical. Knowing how to behave respectfully could ease negotiations, prevent offense, and open trust. Merchants often carried small religious items alongside their trade goods, a symbol sewn into clothing, a short text wrapped carefully to protect it from dust, a charm given by family before departure. These objects offered comfort during long journeys, reminders of home and identity beneath unfamiliar skies. In cities, religious buildings appeared quietly. Fire temples stood near markets. Buddhist shrines were built close to roads. Other meeting places formed within homes or courtyards. None dominated the skyline. Instead, they blended into daily life, part of the city's rhythm rather than separate from it. Festivals reflected this blending as well. Some celebrations were local, tied to seasons and harvests. Others followed religious calendars brought from afar. Music, food, and storytelling often overlapped. A festival might begin with one tradition and end with shared feasting that belonged to everyone. These moments reinforced community, even among differences. For the Sogdian traders, faith and trade were not separate paths. Both required trust. Both involved unseen forces, fortune, chance, the goodwill of others. Belief offered a way to interpret success and failure, to endure loss, to remain hopeful after hardship. When journeys ended badly, faith provided explanation without bitterness. When journeys ended well, it offered gratitude without arrogance. Children grew up aware of this diversity. They saw adults bow in different ways, speak different prayers, mark different days as special. Rather than confusion, this created familiarity. Difference became expected. Curiosity replaced fear. They learned early that meaning could take many forms and that none required violence to survive. Of course, tension did exist. Ideas sometimes clashed. Disagreements arose. But the road discouraged extremity. A merchant who refused to engage with others risked isolation. Cooperation remained essential. Over time, this practical need for coexistence shaped a culture of tolerance stronger than any single doctrine. The movement of faith along the Silk Road also meant transformation. Beliefs adapted as they traveled. Stories were retold with local references. Practices shifted to fit new environments. What arrived was never exactly what had departed. In this way, Sogdiana became not just a crossroads, but a place of quiet synthesis. At night, after the fires burned low, some travelers sat alone, reflecting on what they had heard and seen. Under the same stars watched by countless others before them, they wondered about fate, about justice, about the meaning of their constant movement. These questions did not demand immediate answers. They simply accompanied the journey. Faith, like trade, moved at the pace of trust. It did not rush. It waited for understanding. And because of this patience, ideas that travelled through Sogdiana often survived long after cities changed and routes shifted. As dawn approached, caravans prepared once more to depart. Along with silk and spices, they carried prayers learned from strangers, thoughts sparked by shared conversations, and beliefs shaped by the road itself. Saddlebags were tightened, loads adjusted. And among the practical necessities of travel rode something less visible but just as enduring: the quiet conviction that the world was vast, meaningful, and connected, and that every journey, outward or inward, continued onward, guided by questions as old as the road itself. There was no single morning when the Silk Road announced itself to the world. No banner was raised, no decree issued. Instead, it emerged gradually, shaped by repetition and memory, by footsteps following footsteps, until paths became dependable and dependability became expectation. By the time later historians would give it a name, the Sogdians had already been living within its rhythm for generations. For them, the road was not a line stretching from one empire to another. It was a web flexible, responsive, alive. Routes shifted with the seasons. A mountain pass might be open one year and impassable the next. A river crossing could change with a flood. Political tensions closed some paths while opening others. The Sogdians adapted to all of this, not by resisting change, but by anticipating it. Their advantage lay in familiarity. They did not attempt to travel the entire distance from east to west themselves. Instead, they mastered stretches of road they knew intimately. They understood which oasis could support a large caravan, which market offered fair exchange, which local ruler expected gifts, and which preferred formal agreements. Trade moved in stages, and the Sogdians excelled at managing the spaces in between. As silk began to flow westward in greater quantities, It passed through many hands, but again and again, Sogdian merchants appeared at crucial points along the way. They organized caravans, financed journeys, arranged storage, and coordinated exchanges. They connected producers, middlemen, and buyers into a functioning system long before the system had a name. Their role was not always visible, but it was essential. When silk arrived in distant cities, few thought about the many negotiations that had made its journey possible. Yet behind each bolt of cloth lay months of planning, countless conversations, and careful navigation of risk. The Sogdians became experts in managing uncertainty, spreading investments across multiple caravans, diversifying goods, and maintaining networks that could absorb loss without collapsing. Communication held everything together. Letters travelled constantly along the road, carried by trusted hands. These messages updated partners on prices, dangers, political shifts, and opportunities. A single letter could redirect an entire caravan, saving it from closed borders or guiding it toward a newly prosperous market. Written words became as valuable as any physical cargo. Sogdian communities began to appear far beyond their homeland. In oasis towns, frontier cities, and foreign capitals, merchants settled temporarily or permanently. They built homes, married locally, and formed associations that supported newcomers from the same background. These communities served as anchors, familiar points in unfamiliar landscapes, offering shelter, information, and trust. Over time, these settlements formed a chain of connection, stretching across Central Asia and into China. A merchant arriving in a distant city might find someone who spoke his language, shared his customs, and understood his needs. This sense of continuity made long-distance trade sustainable. The road no longer felt endless. It felt inhabited. The Sogdians also understood the importance of appearing non-threatening. Unlike imperial officials or conquering armies, they arrived as guests. They respected local authority, adapted to local customs, and avoided displays of dominance. Their influence grew precisely because it was understated. Rulers found them useful rather than dangerous, and so allowed them space to operate. As trade intensified, the Silk Road became more than an economic network. It turned into a corridor of exchange for ideas, technologies, and culture. Paper-making techniques moved westward. Artistic styles blended. Musical instruments travelled with performers. The Sogdians participated in all of this, not as passive carriers, but as active interpreters, explaining and adapting what they carried to new audiences. Chinese records began to note their presence. They were recognized as skilled traders, intermediaries, and diplomats. Some served officially at foreign courts, advising on Western regions or facilitating exchanges. Others worked quietly, maintaining the steady flow of goods that empires had come to rely upon. Yet even as their reach expanded, the Sogdians did not abandon their roots. Their homeland remained central to their identity. Profits earned abroad flowed back into cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, funding construction, patronage, and community life. The wealth of the road strengthened the cities of clay, reinforcing the foundation laid by generations before. Daily life for a Silk Road merchant remained demanding. Journeys were long. Illness, accidents, and loss were constant risks. Animals could die, weather could turn suddenly, political alliances could shift overnight. But preparation softened these dangers. Experience taught patience. Networks provided resilience. There was also pride, not loud or boastful, but steady. To be part of the road was to belong to something larger than oneself. Each successful journey reaffirmed the value of cooperation across difference. Each exchange proved that trust could bridge distance. As night fell on the road, caravans gathered as they always had. Fires burned low. Goods were checked and rechecked. Letters were read again by lamplight. Somewhere among the travellers, a Sogdian merchant listened more than he spoke, absorbing the tone of the place, the concerns of others, the subtle signs of change. The Silk Road didn't belong to one people, but without the Sogdians, it might never have become what it did. They were its quiet architects, shaping its flow, maintaining its balance, and ensuring its continuity across generations. And so, as silk continued its long journey westward and silver moved east, the road itself seemed to breathe more steadily. Paths grew familiar, expectations formed, a network became a system. Still, nothing was fixed forever. New powers stirred beyond the horizon. Winds of change began to ripple across the steppe. The road would endure, but those who walked it would face new challenges, new negotiations, new tests of adaptability. For now, though, the Silk Road thrived alive with movement, sustained by trust, and carried forward by merchants who understood that the greatest value they transported was not silk or gold, but connection itself, flowing onward into the unfolding story of empire, ambition, and transformation yet to come. As the Silk Road matured, its influence reached far beyond markets and caravanserais. The steady flow of goods and information eventually drew the attention of those who ruled from palaces and tents alike. Emperors, kings, and khagans began to recognize that control over land alone was not enough. Influence now traveled with merchants, and among them the Sogdians stood out as quiet masters of connection. Sogdian merchants found themselves welcomed into courts, not because they commanded armies, but because they commanded understanding. They arrived bearing gifts carefully chosen to please unfamiliar tastes, fine textiles, rare metals, crafted objects that carried stories of distant places. These offerings were not bribes, but introductions, opening conversations that might otherwise remain closed. At imperial courts, protocol mattered. Every gesture had meaning. Where to stand, when to speak, how deeply to bow, all could determine success or failure. The Sogdians learned these rules quickly. They observed before acting, adjusting their behavior to match the customs of each court. Their respect for local traditions earned them trust, and trust opened doors. Chinese courts valued order, hierarchy, and ritual. Here, Sogdian traders became skilled navigators of formality. They worked through interpreters when needed, presented goods in prescribed ways, and framed their requests carefully. In return, they gained access to markets, permissions to travel, and sometimes official roles as intermediaries between the Chinese state and Western regions. To the west and north, nomadic Khagans ruled from mobile courts, their power grounded in loyalty and strength rather than walls. Here, relationships were built differently. Feasting replaced ceremony. Shared meals and open conversation mattered more than rigid protocol. Sogdian merchants adapted again, participating in these gatherings, offering gifts that demonstrated respect rather than luxury, and listening closely to understand shifting alliances. These interactions required more than surface knowledge. A merchant who misunderstood a ruler's expectations could jeopardize not only his own venture, but the safety of future caravans. Because of this, Sogdians often acted collectively. Information gathered at one court was shared widely, ensuring that others approached with awareness and caution. Some Sogdians became official envoys, carrying messages between rulers who did not share a common language or worldview. They translated not only words, but intent. A phrase that sounded threatening in one culture might be softened in another. A request that seemed minor in one court could carry great weight in another. The Sogdians learned to bridge these gaps, preventing conflict through careful communication. Power, however, was never stable. Dynasties rose and fell. Alliances shifted. A ruler favourable to trade might be replaced by one suspicious of outsiders. In these moments, adaptability mattered most. Sogdian merchants learned to wait when necessary, to redirect routes, to maintain relationships quietly until conditions improved. Despite their proximity to power, they rarely sought to become rulers themselves. Courts were places of opportunity, but also danger. Intrigue, jealousy, and sudden reversals were common. The Sogdians preferred influence without visibility, a position that allowed them to retreat if needed, without leaving a target behind. Their presence at court influenced more than trade. Artistic tastes shifted as foreign goods and styles were admired by elites. Clothing patterns, musical instruments, and decorative motifs spread through elite circles before filtering into broader society. Sogdian merchants often facilitated these exchanges, advising on meaning and use. Even religious ideas found pathways through courts. Rulers curious about new beliefs invited teachers and texts, sometimes as political gestures, sometimes from genuine interest. Sogdians, already familiar with multiple traditions, helped guide these introductions, ensuring that unfamiliar practices were presented respectfully. At times, the relationship between merchant and ruler grew personal. A trusted trader might become an advisor, consulted on matters of foreign policy or regional conditions. Such roles carried risk, but also influence. The Sogdians navigated these positions carefully, always aware that their strength lay in mobility rather than attachment. When courtly favour was granted, it brought tangible benefits. Trade privileges, protection for caravans, reduced taxes, all strengthened the Silk Road network. When favour was withdrawn, routes could close overnight. The Sogdians learned to read these shifts early, watching for subtle changes in tone, access, and response. Through it all, they remained consistent in one thing: their commitment to connection. Whether speaking to an emperor beneath a roof of carved wood or to a kagan beneath an open sky, they carried the same purpose: to keep the road open, the exchange flowing, the conversation alive. As evening settled over distant capitals, lamps were lit in palaces and tents alike. Somewhere within these spaces, a Sogdian merchant stood quietly, waiting for the right moment to speak, carrying the weight of many journeys and many voices. Outside, beyond the walls or the encampment, caravans rested, unaware of how decisions made in these halls would shape their path. The road depended on such moments, on words chosen carefully, on trust earned slowly, on relationships maintained through change. And as the courts of emperors and kagans continued to turn, the Sogdians remained where they had always been, in between, steady and watchful, ensuring that the great network of movement endured, ready to carry the world forward into whatever future awaited beyond the next horizon. To live within the Silk Road was to accept motion as a constant companion. For the Sogdians, movement was not an interruption to life, it was life, unfolding day by day across distances both familiar and strange. Even when standing still, the world around them shifted, shaped by the steady passage of people, animals, ideas, and goods. Inside a caravan, life followed a rhythm shaped by necessity. Days began early, often before the sun fully rose. Animals were checked, loads adjusted, water measured carefully. Nothing was wasted. A misjudged weight or poorly tied bundle could turn a long journey into disaster. These routines became second nature, performed quietly, almost without thought. Travelers walked when terrain demanded it, rode when they could, and rested when the land allowed. Conversations came in fragments, brief exchanges while moving, longer talks during pauses. Silence was common and comfortable. The road taught that not every moment needed words. Meals were simple and repetitive, yet deeply grounding. Flatbread, dried fruit, nuts, and occasionally meat formed the core of most diets. Water was treasured. Each sip was taken with awareness. Food carried from home was rationed carefully, while local provisions were welcomed as small gifts of variety. Sharing food reinforced trust, especially among those who depended on one another for survival. Shelter changed constantly. Some nights were spent in caravanserais, sturdy roadside inns with walls, wells, and guarded gates. These places offered safety, rest, and the rare luxury of privacy. Other nights were passed beneath open skies, with only tents or blankets for cover. The stars became familiar companions, marking time more reliably than any calendar. Within this moving world, social bonds formed quickly. Travelers relied on one another regardless of origin. Skills mattered more than status. Someone who could mend leather, treat an animal, or read the landscape earned quiet respect. Authority was fluid, shifting with circumstance rather than fixed rank. For the Sogdians, adaptability extended beyond logistics. Clothing was layered and practical, designed to suit varying climates. Language shifted with location. Customs adjusted without loss of identity. The ability to belong temporarily, without claiming ownership, became a defining trait. Family life adapted as well. Long absences were common, and reunions deeply valued. Letters bridged distance, carrying reassurance and news. When possible, families travelled together, turning caravans into temporary communities. Children grew up learning resilience early, understanding that home could be both a place and a path. Markets and cities punctuated the journey, offering moments of stillness within motion. Here, life slowed briefly, repairs were made, animals rested, information was exchanged. These pauses were essential, allowing travelers to reset before continuing onward. Illness and injury were ever-present risks. Without modern medicine, recovery depended on rest, knowledge, and care from companions. Herbal remedies were shared across cultures. Practical wisdom travelled as freely as goods. Survival reinforced cooperation, dissolving boundaries that might otherwise divide. Time itself felt different on the road. Days blurred together, measured by distance covered rather than dates. The past lingered in memory, the future shaped by weather and rumour. Patience became a necessity. Plans remained flexible, ready to change at a moment's notice. Despite the hardships, there was beauty in this life. Dawn breaking over open land. The quiet satisfaction of reaching a long-sought oasis. the comfort of familiar faces in unfamiliar places. These moments balance the strain, offering reasons to continue. The Silk Road also reshaped how people understood the world. Exposure to constant change bred tolerance. Difference became ordinary. Curiosity replaced fear. For the Sogdians, identity was strengthened through comparison rather than isolation. At the heart of this moving world was trust in companions, in routines, in the road itself. Each successful journey reinforced confidence. Each return home reaffirmed purpose. Movement was not escape, but contribution. As night fell, caravans settled once more. Fires were lit. Animals lay down. Conversations softened. The world seemed to pause, if only briefly. Tomorrow would bring more movement, more challenges, more encounters. And within this ever-shifting landscape, the Sogdians found balance not by resisting change, but by moving with it. Life inside the Silk Road was demanding, uncertain, and deeply human. It carried people forward, step by step, across a world always in motion, continuing onward into the next stretch of the road, where new stories waited quietly to be lived. Not all journeys along the Silk Road were made by people or animals. Some travelled folded and sealed, carried close to the body, protected from dust and rain as carefully as any precious cargo. Letters moved quietly across continents, linking those who walked the road with those who waited at its edges. For the Sogdians, these written messages became the threads that held their vast, moving world together. A letter often began in stillness. In a shaded courtyard or a dimly lit room, a merchant sat with ink and brush, choosing words with care. Space on paper was limited, and every sentence mattered. Prices, routes, warnings, and greetings all competed for room. Yet even in practical correspondence, warmth remained. A line for family, a note of reassurance, a reminder of return. These details softened the distance. Writing was a skill highly valued among the Sogdians. It preserved memory and extended presence. Through letters, a merchant could remain part of home life, even while travelling far beyond sight. Decisions were made collectively, guided by information that flowed steadily rather than by guesswork. Once written, letters were entrusted to reliable hands, a traveller known for honesty, a caravan heading in the right direction. Sometimes a chain of carriers passed a message onward, each responsible for its safe arrival. This system depended entirely on trust, built over years of shared experience. The contents of these letters shaped the road itself. News of closed passes or dangerous regions altered routes. Reports of rising demand in one city redirected trade. Political changes recorded in ink warned of shifting alliances. A single message could prevent loss or create opportunity, making letters as valuable as any physical good. Sogdian script travelled widely, recognizable to those who shared the road. Even when words were not fully understood, names, numbers, and seals conveyed meaning. Letters became portable markers of identity, proof of connection in a world where reputation mattered deeply. There were personal letters as well, messages between parents and children, between spouses separated by months or years. These carried emotion carefully contained, knowing that words would travel slowly and might arrive long after they were written. Joy, worry, longing, all were expressed with restraint, shaped by patience. Receiving a letter was an event. In markets or inns, travellers gathered as messages were delivered. Some letters were read aloud, shared with partners. Others were opened privately, their contents absorbed in silence. These moments brought distant places suddenly near, reminding recipients that they were part of something larger. Letters also carried instructions for the future. Contracts outlined terms of partnership. Agreements set expectations across distance. Written words ensured continuity when personal presence was impossible. In this way, letters extended the reach of trust beyond face-to-face interaction. The road itself became a living archive of correspondence. Messages accumulated, tracing patterns of movement and relationship. Over time, this network of writing strengthened the Silk Road, allowing it to function not merely as a series of routes, but as a coordinated system. As night settled and fires burned low, some travelers reread letters by lamplight, tracing familiar handwriting. These moments offered comfort during long absences, reinforcing purpose and connection. Letters did not erase distance, but they made it bearable. They allowed plans to stretch across years, families to endure separation, and trade to flourish across continents. And so, alongside caravans and cities, another journey unfolded. One made of ink and trust, travelling endlessly across miles of dust and stone. In these letters, the Sogdians preserved their world, carrying voices forward even when bodies could not, ensuring that the road remained connected, alive, and ready for whatever lay beyond the next horizon. For a long time, the Sogdians had lived comfortably in the spaces between authority. They had learned how to adapt, how to wait, how to keep the road open regardless of who claimed dominion over the land. But as the Silk Road matured and its wealth deepened, something subtle began to change. Trade no longer followed power alone. In many places, it began to shape it. Rulers who once viewed merchants as useful but peripheral started to see them differently. Caravans brought not only silk and silver, but stability. Cities that thrived on trade were calmer, better supplied, and more predictable. Taxes collected from markets funded walls, armies, and courts. Slowly, those who controlled the flow of goods gained influence over the flow of events. The Sogdians understood this shift early. They did not announce it, but they adapted to it. Where once they had focused primarily on survival and continuity, they now learned to navigate leverage. Access became a form of power. Knowing which route remained open in winter, which market would soon rise in importance, which ruler needed supplies most urgently. These insights carried weight. In some cities, Sogdian merchants became indispensable advisors. They were asked about shortages, about foreign conditions, about the reliability of distant partners. Their answers influenced decisions that extended beyond trade, shaping diplomatic stances, military planning, and settlement policies. Without holding official titles, they began to guide outcomes. This influence required careful balance. Too much visibility invited suspicion. Too little reduced effectiveness. The Sogdians walked this line with practiced restraint, offering information when asked, withholding judgment when not. They understood that power endured longest when it appeared helpful rather than assertive. Economic strength also changed community life. Wealth accumulated in merchant families, allowing for investment in infrastructure. Roads repaired, canals deepened, warehouses expanded. Cities grew more confident, their markets busier, their populations more diverse. Prosperity reinforced the importance of the Silk Road, creating a cycle that fed itself. Yet wealth brought tension. Inequality became more visible. Not all benefited equally from trade. local leaders worried about dependence on foreign networks. Some rulers attempted to control or tax trade more aggressively. Others sought to place merchants under stricter oversight. These efforts often disrupted the delicate balance that had allowed trade to flourish. The Sogdians responded with flexibility rather than confrontation. When restrictions tightened in one region, routes shifted elsewhere. When taxes rose too high, trade slowed quietly. The road had many paths, and pressure in one place could be eased by movement in another. This adaptability limited the effectiveness of heavy-handed control. At times, trade directly influenced conflict. Supplies moved through Sogdian networks determined which armies were better fed or equipped. Information about terrain and conditions shaped campaigns. Merchants became sources of intelligence, whether intentionally or not. Their knowledge of the land gave them insight that generals often lacked. This proximity to power carried risk. Being perceived as too influential could provoke backlash. Some merchants faced accusations of manipulation or disloyalty. In response, the Sogdians emphasized neutrality. They served many rulers, aligned fully with none. Their loyalty lay with the road itself, with continuity rather than domination. Trade also reshaped identity. Success reinforced confidence, but also responsibility. Merchant families took on roles as patrons, supporting religious institutions, artists, and scholars. Cultural life expanded, enriched by resources drawn from far beyond local horizons. The cities of Sogdiana became centers not only of commerce, but of learning and creativity. As trade networks grew denser, decision-making became more complex. A disruption in one region could ripple outward, affecting prices and availability thousands of miles away. The Sogdians learned to think in systems rather than single exchanges. They planned long-term, anticipating change rather than reacting to it. Still, power remained fragile. It depended on trust, and trust could be broken quickly. A single betrayal could undo years of relationship building. For this reason, restraint remained central. The Sogdians avoided forcing outcomes. They preferred persuasion to pressure, patience to haste. As evening settled over a prosperous market, the signs of this new reality were visible. Larger warehouses stood near the gates. Officials consulted merchants as readily as soldiers. Decisions once made by decree now required negotiation. The world was shifting, quietly but decisively. Trade had become more than movement. It had become structure, shaping cities, influencing rulers, and linking distant regions into a shared rhythm. And within this evolving landscape, the Sogdians stood not at the center, but at the joints, holding the system together through careful balance. Yet power, once accumulated, always draws challenge. New forces stirred beyond the horizon. Empires with different priorities, different methods, different visions of control began to emerge. The road would endure, but those who guided it would soon face tests unlike any before. For now, though, the lamps glowed warmly in the markets. Goods moved steadily, agreements were honoured, the road breathed in rhythm. And as trade continued to shape power, the Sogdians remained attentive, knowing that influence was never permanent, only borrowed, and that the road, patient and vast, would carry the consequences forward into the next turning of history. Change rarely announced itself with certainty. More often, it arrived like distant weather, first as rumour, then as unease, and finally as force that could no longer be ignored. For the Sogdians, whose lives depended on stability along the Silk Road. The first signs of trouble came from the open lands to the north, where the steppe stretched wide and restless. The steppe had always been part of the world they knew. Nomadic peoples moved across it with the seasons. Skilled riders whose lives followed rhythms different from those of city dwellers. Trade and coexistence had long been possible. Agreements were made, gifts were exchanged, routes were shared. But the steppe also carried the potential for sudden transformation, when alliances hardened and movement turned into conquest. As new confederations formed, their leaders sought not only pasture and tribute, but control over trade itself. The Silk Road, once a flexible web, became a prize. To command the road was to command resources, information, and influence. For the first time in generations, the Sogdians faced forces that did not merely pass through their world, but aimed to reshape it. At first, disruptions were small, a caravan delayed, a route avoided. A city required additional tribute to guarantee safe passage. Merchants adapted as they always had, adjusting plans, shifting paths, absorbing loss where necessary. Experience had taught them that turbulence often passed. But these storms did not pass quickly. Mounted armies moved with speed unfamiliar to settled societies. Their power lay in mobility, coordination, and decisive action. Where trade networks relied on trust built over time, steppe empires imposed order through authority and fear. The balance that had sustained the Silk Road began to strain. Cities felt the pressure first. Walls were reinforced. Guards doubled. Markets remained open, but caution entered every exchange. Merchants weighed risk more heavily than profit. Some journeys were postponed. Others were rerouted through longer, safer paths, increasing cost and uncertainty. The Sogdians responded with restraint. They did not resist openly. Resistance would have been futile. Instead, they negotiated. They offered service, knowledge, and access in exchange for protection. Their familiarity with the road made them useful even to conquerors. Once again, adaptability became survival. Some Sogdian merchants found themselves working under new authorities, facilitating trade within altered boundaries. Others withdrew temporarily, preserving networks quietly until conditions improved. Families spread risk, sending members in different directions, ensuring that no single disruption could destroy everything. The road itself changed character. Where once it flowed through mutual agreement, it now passed through checkpoints and demands. Movement continued, but under watchful eyes. The sense of openness narrowed. Trust became more fragile, harder to rebuild once broken. Yet even amid these pressures, the Silk Road did not collapse. Too many depended on it. Steppe rulers discovered that trade, if protected, enriched their realms. Caravans resumed, cautiously at first, then with renewed purpose. Sogdian merchants, familiar with managing risk, resumed their role as intermediaries, though now under new constraints. Cultural exchange slowed, but did not cease. Ideas continued to travel, though sometimes disguised, sometimes delayed. Faiths adapted. Languages absorbed new words. The road remained a living system, though altered in tone. For the Sogdians, these years demanded endurance. Losses were felt, of goods, of lives, of certainty. Some cities declined. Others adapted, integrating new rulers into their rhythms. Memory of earlier freedom lingered, but so did determination. At night, beneath the same stars that had watched generations of travelers before them, merchants reflected on how quickly the world could change. They spoke softly of past journeys, of routes once open, of markets once bustling. Yet they also planned for tomorrow, knowing that movement, however constrained, must continue. The storms from the steppe reshaped the Silk Road, but they did not erase it. They tested the resilience of those who depended on it, forcing adaptation on a new scale. For the Sogdians, this period marked a turning point, a reminder that even the most carefully balanced systems could be disrupted by forces beyond negotiation. Still, the road endured. It bent, it narrowed, it shifted, but it did not break. And within this altered landscape, the Sogdians continued to walk, carrying forward what they could: knowledge, connection, and the quiet understanding that survival did not always mean victory, but persistence. As dawn rose after another uneasy night, caravans prepared once more to move. Loads were lighter. Routes were chosen with care. The world had changed, but the journey continued, leading onward into a future shaped by new masters, new beliefs, and challenges yet unseen, waiting just beyond the horizon, where the steppe met the road once again. The changes that followed the storms from the steppe did not arrive all at once. They came gradually, carried along the same roads that had once delivered silk and silver, now bearing new rulers, new languages of authority, and new ways of understanding the world. For the Sogdians, whose lives had always been shaped by adaptation, this era demanded a deeper kind of adjustment, one that reached beyond trade and into identity itself. New powers settled into the lands of Central Asia, bringing with them different structures of rule. Where earlier empires had governed from a distance, relying on local systems to maintain order, these new masters often sought clearer control. Administration became more centralized. Laws were standardized. The flexibility that had once allowed cities and merchants to negotiate space narrowed. Alongside political change came religious transformation. Islam spread steadily across the region, carried by conquest, settlement, and sincere belief. Its message was clear, structured, and powerful, offering a unified framework of faith, law, and community. For many, it brought comfort and order in uncertain times. For others, it represented a profound shift away from the pluralism they had known. Sogdian cities began to change in subtle ways. Mosques appeared beside older temples. The call to prayer joined the sounds of markets and streets. New calendars shaped daily rhythms. Over time, conversion became common, sometimes voluntary, sometimes encouraged by circumstance. The old beliefs did not vanish overnight, but their place in public life gradually diminished. This transformation was not only spiritual, it reshaped language, names, and customs. Arabic and Persian gained prominence. Sogdian, once spoken across markets and households, retreated slowly, lingering in private spaces before fading further with each generation. Identity, once fluid and layered, began to settle into new forms defined by broader affiliations. For the merchant families, these changes brought difficult choices. Some adapted fully, integrating into the new order, continuing trade under altered rules. Others struggled to find their place, their skills still valuable, but their cultural footing less secure. Networks that had taken centuries to build loosened as borders hardened and priorities shifted. Yet even as the old ways faded, the skills of the Sogdians did not disappear entirely. Their expertise in trade, language, and mediation was absorbed into the emerging societies. Though the name Sogdian became less common, the influence of their practices lived on, embedded in systems that continued to rely on movement and exchange. There was loss in this transition, of language, of tradition, of a distinct way of seeing the world. Cities that had once thrived as open crossroads became more inward focused. The Silk Road remained active, but its character changed, shaped now by new powers and beliefs that valued unity over diversity. Families remembered the past in fragments. Old stories were told quietly. Words from the Sogdian language survived in place, names in borrowed terms, in memories passed down without written record. The road still ran through the land, but fewer remembered who had first woven its connections so patiently. For those living through this era, the future was uncertain. Some felt hope in the clarity of new structures. Others felt disoriented, mourning what was slipping away. Yet life continued. Markets opened, caravans travelled. Children grew up knowing a world already transformed, unaware of what had come before. In this way, the Sogdians did not vanish in a moment. They dissolved slowly into the cultures they had once connected, becoming part of something larger, less distinct, but enduring. Their legacy shifted from identity to influence. As night falls on this chapter of the road, imagine an aging merchant standing at the edge of a familiar city, watching new buildings rise where old ones once stood. The sounds are different now, the language unfamiliar. Yet the road beyond the gate remains. It stretches onward, unchanged in purpose if not in form. The world has turned as it always does. New beliefs have taken root. New masters guide the flow of power. And though the name of the Sogdians begins to fade from spoken memory, the patterns they created endure. In trade routes still travelled, in customs still practiced, in the quiet understanding that connection outlasts control. The road moves forward, carrying with it the echoes of those who walked it before, into a future shaped by change, continuity, and the long, patient unfolding of history. The end of the Sogdians was not marked by conquest alone, nor by a single turning point that history could easily name. It came instead as a long evening, settling gradually over a people whose strength had always been movement rather than permanence. As the centuries passed, the road they had shaped continued onward, but the distinct presence of those who once guided it began to soften, then slowly dissolve. In the cities of their homeland, change was visible in small details. Market conversations shifted into new languages. Legal documents followed new systems of law. Children grew up learning customs that no longer matched those of their grandparents. What had once felt fluid and layered became more uniform, more closely tied to the identities of larger states and shared faiths. Trade continued, but the role of the intermediary narrowed. New powers favoured centralised control, fixed routes, and formal oversight. The informal networks that had once allowed Sogdian merchants to thrive became harder to maintain. Trust was replaced by regulation. Flexibility gave way to structure. Some Sogdian families adapted fully, blending into the societies that replaced the old order. They changed names, adopted new customs, and continued their work quietly, no longer identified by origin, but by profession. Others withdrew from long-distance trade, turning instead to local commerce, agriculture, or crafts. The road still passed nearby, but it no longer belonged to them in the same way. Language faded most quietly of all. Without official status or written preservation, Sogdian survived only in fragments, in private speech, in borrowed words, in place names that outlasted memory. Each generation spoke it less until one day it was no longer spoken at all. No announcement marked its passing. Silence simply took its place. Religion followed a similar path. Older beliefs lingered in habit and custom, but public life aligned increasingly with new faiths. Temples fell into disuse or were repurposed. Rituals once familiar became stories, then memories, then echoes too faint to follow clearly. What made this fading distinct was its lack of drama. There were no final battles fought in the name of Sogdian identity, no declarations of loss. The people had always understood adaptation as survival, and so they adapted again, even as that very skill dissolved the boundaries that had once defined them. The Silk Road itself reflected this transformation. It remained active, but its rhythm changed. Maritime routes began to draw trade away from the long land crossings. Empires shifted their focus. The centrality of the old caravan networks diminished, though they never disappeared entirely. In the cities that had once thrived as crossroads, prosperity ebbed and flowed unevenly. Some declined, their walls crumbling slowly back into the earth. Others endured, transformed into centers shaped by new cultural forces. The old layers remained beneath the surface, visible only to those who knew where to look. Memory survived longest in family stories. Elders spoke of ancestors who had travelled far, who had spoken many tongues, who had lived lives defined by movement. These stories grew less detailed with time, more symbolic than specific. Eventually, even these accounts blended into broader histories, their origins obscured. Yet influence does not require recognition to endure. The practices that had once defined Sogdian life, negotiation, tolerance, adaptability, lived on within the cultures that absorbed them. Trade continued to rely on trust. Cities continued to form at crossroads. People continued to move between worlds, carrying more than they realized. The quiet fading of the Sogdians was not a failure, but a transformation. They did not disappear because they were defeated, but because they succeeded too well at connecting themselves to others. In doing so, they became inseparable from the broader history they had helped shape. As night settles over the old caravan routes, imagine walking through a city that once echoed with many languages. The streets are quieter now, the names changed, the customs different. Yet the road still runs through it, worn smooth by centuries of passage. Beneath the dust, beneath the stone, beneath the new layers of life, the memory of a trading people remains. Not carved in monuments, but carried forward in habits, systems, and ways of seeing the world that continue to guide those who travel, even when they no longer know who first showed them the way. The fading is gentle, almost imperceptible, like footsteps receding into distance. And though the Sogdians no longer walk the road as themselves, the road still carries their imprint, stretching onward into the future, shaped forever by those who once lived between worlds and taught the desert how to listen. Even after a people fade from clear view, they rarely vanish entirely. They leave traces, subtle, scattered, often unnoticed by those who walk among them. For the Sogdians, whose lives were shaped by movement and exchange, these echoes lingered not in grand monuments, but in quieter forms, in patterns, in words, in habits passed along without attribution. In the art of Central Asia and beyond, careful observers can still glimpse their presence. Wall paintings in ancient cities show figures dressed in flowing garments, faces turned toward one another in scenes of feasting, music, and trade. The style is distinctive, expressive, yet restrained, filled with motion even in stillness. These images do not glorify conquest. They celebrate connection, hospitality, and the pleasure of shared life. Long after the artists' names were forgotten, their vision endured. Textiles, too, carried memory. Certain patterns travelled widely, repeated and adapted across regions. Motifs of vines, animals, and celestial forms appeared again and again, woven into cloth that moved along the Silk Road. The designs changed subtly with each place they reached, but their origins remained embedded in the weave. To touch such fabric was to touch a story shaped by many hands. Language preserved quieter traces. Though spoken, Sogdian disappeared. Its influence lingered in borrowed words absorbed into Persian, Turkic, and other tongues. Place names survived where cities once stood, anchoring memory to landscape. Even when meaning was lost, sound remained. A reminder that something had once been spoken there. In records written by others, the Sogdians appeared briefly, often described from the outside, as traders, intermediaries, foreigners. These accounts were incomplete, shaped by the priorities of empires rather than the lived experience of the people themselves. Yet even in these fragments, their importance was clear. They were noted not for armies or monuments, but for presence, for being everywhere along the road. Memory also lived in custom, the way markets were organized, the expectation that negotiation could end peacefully, the assumption that strangers might bring opportunity rather than threat. These attitudes did not belong to one culture alone, but they were strengthened by generations of Sogdian practice. They became habits so familiar that their origins were forgotten. In families descended from Silk Road communities, stories sometimes surfaced without names attached. Tales of ancestors who travelled far, who spoke many languages, who lived between worlds. Over time, these stories blurred, merging with others, losing detail. Yet their themes persisted: adaptability, curiosity, resilience. Archaeology, centuries later, began to uncover what memory had softened. Ruins emerged from beneath sand and soil. Documents preserved in dry climates revealed letters written in careful script, concerned with prices, safety, and family. These discoveries did not restore a living culture, but they illuminated its shape, allowing the modern world to glimpse what had once been. What stands out most in these remnants is not dominance, but connection. The Sogdians did not seek to leave their mark through force. Their legacy was relational, visible only when one looks at how worlds touched and influenced one another. Even the concept of the Silk Road itself reflects this inheritance. It is remembered not as a single empire's achievement, but as a shared system, shaped by many hands over time. At its heart lies the idea that distance can be bridged, that difference can be navigated, that movement can create meaning. These ideas align closely with the way the Sogdians lived. As night deepens and the mind drifts toward rest, imagine walking through a museum or across a quiet ruin. A fragment of painting catches the eye. A line of text carved into stone resists erosion. These are not loud reminders. They whisper rather than declare. The Sogdians remain present in these whispers, in the confidence of travellers who trust unfamiliar roads, in the ease with which cultures borrow from one another, in the enduring belief that exchange enriches all who take part. Memory does not always preserve names, but it preserves patterns. And in the patterns of art, language, and custom that continue to shape the world, the Sogdians still move quietly, unseen yet influential, guiding the flow of connection as they always did. The road they helped build may no longer be walked in the same way, but its spirit remains, carried forward in every act of exchange, every moment of understanding across distance, echoing gently through time, waiting to be noticed by those who listen closely enough. The Silk Road, as the Sogdians once knew it, no longer exists in the form of caravans stretching across deserts beneath open skies. Its wells have dried, its routes have shifted, its cities changed names or fallen silent. And yet, the road itself never truly ended. It simply learned new shapes, carrying forward the same purpose under different skies. Long after the Sogdians faded as a distinct people, the patterns they helped establish endured. Trade continued to link distant regions. Ideas continued to cross borders. Languages continued to borrow from one another. The tools changed. Ships replaced caravans. Ports replaced oases. But the logic of connection remained the same. Movement still created understanding. Exchange still shaped the world. What made the Sogdians remarkable was never empire or conquest. It was their quiet insistence that distance could be navigated without domination. That difference didn't require fear, and that trust, patiently built, could sustain entire systems. These ideas outlived their name. In many ways, the modern world still lives within their inheritance. Every global network, every supply chain, every exchange of culture across continents echoes the old rhythm of the road. The questions faced by the Sogdians, how to cooperate across difference, how to adapt to change, how to balance profit with responsibility, remain familiar today. Their story reminds us that history is not only shaped by rulers and battles, but by those who move between worlds, carrying knowledge quietly from one place to another. The Sogdians rarely stood at the center of attention, yet without them, the center might never have held. As night settles gently over this long journey, imagine the road one last time, not as a line on a map, but as a shared space created by countless lives. Picture the desert breathing softly. Picture distant lights marking cities where strangers once met and spoke. Hear the faint echo of footsteps, steady and unhurried. Somewhere along that road, a merchant pauses. He looks up at the stars, the same stars that guided his ancestors. He does not know how far his influence will travel, or how long it will last. He only knows the next step, the next conversation, the next act of trust. That is how the road survives. Not through permanence, but through continuation. And so, as this story comes to rest, let it do so gently, like a caravan settling for the night. Let the noise of the day fade. Let the vastness of time stretch comfortably around you. The Sogdians have passed into history, but the road they shaped still moves beneath the world, connecting lives in ways both seen and unseen. May your thoughts drift as softly as desert wind over sand. May the road feel long, but never lonely. And may the quiet footsteps of the past guide you calmly and kindly into rest.